I was the family's punching bag for mom and my golden child, sister until I recorded the truth and showed dad what was really happening at home. I, 17F, have an older sister, 20F, and she has always been the golden child, at least in my mother's eyes. My mom never tried to hide the fact that my sister was her favorite, and well, it's definitely not me. Even as a child, I could tell my mom preferred my sister over me. I never understood why. I spent years trying to copy my sister, doing whatever she did, hoping to win my mother's approval. But no matter how much I tried, the things she loved about my sister were the same things she found irritating in me. Eventually, I gave up trying to impress her because it felt like a losing battle. At least my dad liked me for who I was and didn't expect me to be a clone of my sister to earn his love. My dad never played favorites. He treated my sister and me equally, and I'll always be thankful for that. At least one parent had my back. My mother, however, wasn't easy to be around. She made sure her worst behavior only came out when it was just me and my sister around. When my dad was home, she acted like the perfect parent, which made things even harder for me. It would have been easier if my dad had been home more, but when I was younger, his job required a lot of travel, and it still does. So, I spent most of my time with my mom and sister. The problem was that my mom was a stay-at-home parent, so she was always around. Anytime I got home from school, she would start criticizing me and making me feel bad about myself. She constantly picked apart my appearance, finding new ways to make me feel insecure every single day. For context, I've always been naturally thin, something my mom reminded me was undesirable in girls. I also wore glasses and had a messy haircut, which she frequently criticized. Despite her toxic personality, my mom was actually very beautiful, and so was my sister. She often said she wished I had inherited her looks, but instead, I was the ugly duckling. She made sure I never forgot it. To make matters worse, my sister excelled at nearly everything. Sports, academics, you name it. I did well in school and was a good student, but I was terrible at sports. I had no hand-eye coordination and hated anything athletic. My mom, however, insisted I participate, convinced it would somehow fix my body and make me more presentable. She also forced me to eat foods she thought were good for me, like absurd amounts of protein. Honestly, there's only so much meat one person can eat before feeling sick, and that's exactly what happened to me. I think that's why I eventually became a vegetarian a few years ago, because of how much beef and chicken she made me eat growing up. It didn't help. Some people are just naturally thin, and I'm one of them. I didn't even have a problem with my body until my mom started tearing it apart. To avoid her criticism, I began wearing oversized clothes and my sister's old hand-me-downs, just to hide myself. I was terrified of what she'd say if I wore anything that showed my body. That's how things were for me until a couple of years ago, when I discovered the one thing I was actually good at: swimming. I had never tried it before because my mother never encouraged me. She's terrified of water herself, so swimming wasn't even on her radar. But 2 years ago, I got the chance to try out for the school swim team, and everything changed. I don't want to sound dramatic, but swimming genuinely changed my life. For the first time, I found something I was great at, and I poured my heart and soul into it. Within months, I started to see the results. I became more toned and gained healthy weight, which made me both look and feel better. For the first time in my life, I was confident and genuinely happy. But my newfound confidence didn't sit well with my mother and sister. They didn't like my progress, because it meant they couldn't pick on me about my appearance anymore. As I started looking better, their usual taunts stopped, but I underestimated just how much they resented me. Instead of easing up, they found new ways to make my life miserable. They started giving me what I call the Cinderella treatment. They expected me to be at their beck and call all day, every day. Anytime they saw me relaxing or taking a break, they would assign me another chore. Before I knew it, I wasn't just doing most of the housework. I was doing everything. Whenever my dad was away on business trips, my mother and sister made sure I handled all the household responsibilities. They'd make excuses to avoid helping, claiming they were too tired or busy. If I said I was overwhelmed or tired from school, they'd brush it off, saying I had to do it because no one else would. My mother often said she was too old to handle the work herself, even though she was only in her early 40s, which isn't that old. My sister, on the other hand, claimed she was buried in school activities and couldn't possibly pitch in. To put it bluntly, I became their Cinderella. Their goal was to wear me down so much that I'd quit swimming. But I refused to give up the one thing that brought me happiness. Thankfully, this only happened when my dad was out of town. Unfortunately, that was about half the month. During the weeks he was home, things were relatively normal, and everyone had to share the workload equally. You might wonder why I didn't tell my dad about any of this. The truth is, I didn't want to create conflict in the family. At the end of the day, I just wanted everyone to be happy. Looking back, I guess you could say I was a bit of a people pleaser, and that trait caused most of my problems. I was always trying to make everyone happy. I knew my dad truly loved my mother. They were high school sweethearts who got married right after college. I'd heard countless stories from relatives about how deeply in love they were. I knew it would break my dad's heart if he ever found out what my mother had become. So, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be the one to shatter his illusions by telling him the truth. I hoped and prayed that he'd figure it out on his own or that, by some miracle, my mother would change and treat me better. But neither of those things ever happened. I also had this constant fear that, even if I told my dad, he wouldn't believe me. My mother and sister always put on a perfect act, pretending to be a loving parent and sibling whenever he was around. There was a real chance he'd think I was exaggerating or making it up, and I couldn't risk losing the only good relationship I had in my family. So, I kept my mouth shut and silently endured it. But recently, I decided I couldn't stay quiet any longer. Their behavior had gone too far. I was completely overwhelmed from doing all the housework. While I managed to handle it when I was in lower grades with less homework, things had become unmanageable. Now that I was taking advanced classes, I couldn't afford to lose so much time and energy on chores. What really pushed me to this decision was getting a phone for my 17th birthday. Before that, I didn't have one because my parents believed it would distract me from my studies. Whether they were right or wrong, it had been incredibly inconvenient and frustrating. But this year, my dad surprised me with a brand new phone for personal use, and I finally had the means to expose what was happening at home. The final straw came 2 weeks ago when I got my first C on an assignment. The night before it was due, I had to spend hours doing laundry because my mom refused to do it, and my sister claimed she was too busy. I couldn't just wash my own clothes and leave theirs behind. It would have caused a massive argument. So, I ended up doing everyone's laundry. The chore ate up most of my evening, leaving me barely any time or energy to work on my essay. As a result, the essay turned out rushed and mediocre. I got a bad grade, and even though it wasn't my fault, I couldn't blame the teacher. She had no idea what I was dealing with at home. When I got home that day, I decided I'd had enough. I confronted my mother and told her I wasn't going to do any more chores around the house. I said she and my sister would have to start pulling their weight. But my mother dismissed me entirely. She said it was my fault for struggling in school and that if I just put in more effort, I wouldn't need to make excuses. She even brought up how my sister was managing to excel in school while participating in extracurricular activities, all while I was sitting there blaming others for my failures. That was it, my breaking point. I decided I couldn't take it anymore and had to put an end to this. I couldn't record anything in that moment, but I made up my mind. The next time she said or did something cruel, I'd have my phone ready to capture it all and send it to my dad. The next day, my dad came home and stayed with us for a few days before heading off on another business trip. I knew exactly what would happen once he left. The two of them would gang up on me and force me to do all the housework. This time, I was prepared. On the day my dad left, I set up my phone to record. Just as I'd expected, as soon as he was out the door, my mom and sister barged into my room. They didn't even bother to knock. They started rattling off a list of chores I had to do, not even pretending to ask politely. Their final words were, "Get to work." This time, I stood my ground. I told them I wasn't going to do any of it. Thankfully, they didn't hold back their nastiness, completely unaware that my phone was recording every word. My mom called me a lazy girl and said she was training me to do the housework because, in her opinion, my grades and attitude meant I'd never amount to anything. She added that studying was pointless and a waste of their money. My sister jumped in, saying that just because she could juggle school and extracurriculars didn't mean I could. She told me to give up because it was pathetic and that I should stick to doing chores. At least then, she said, I'd have a shot at getting a job as a maid someday. They kept going, hurling insults and making cruel comments. They were nastier than usual, which, in a twisted way, was lucky for me. It was all on camera. My blood was boiling, but I kept my mouth shut, knowing this would likely be the last time they'd get away with treating me like this. When they were done, my mom told me to stop wasting time and get to work before slamming the door behind her. The moment she left, I stopped recording. I sent the video to my dad with a long message explaining everything. I told him about the constant bullying I'd endured for years, how they ganged up on me whenever he wasn't home, and how they treated me like a maid instead of a family member. I also described the cruel things they said about me and how their behavior had made me too afraid to stand up for myself. I explained how the stress of it all was taking a toll on me and even affecting my grades. I told him I couldn't take it anymore. I don't think it had even been an hour since my dad left the house when I sent him the video. I assumed he was already on his flight by then, but luckily, he hadn't boarded yet. He saw my message just in time and immediately called me. He told me to lock myself in my room and not do anything until he got home. He said he was turning around and coming back right away. For about 45 minutes, I sat quietly in my room, waiting. Then, I heard my dad pull into the driveway, and I knew things were about to get serious. I stayed in my room, even when I heard my mom open the door and ask why he was back so soon. Moments later, I heard my dad yelling at her about the video I'd sent. He demanded to know what she and my sister thought they were doing. They tried to brush it off as a joke, but my dad wasn't buying it. He'd read the entire message I'd sent with the video and told them to stop pretending. He wanted answers. That's when my mom realized the jig was up. She couldn't hide it anymore. My dad finally knew how she'd been treating me. She started begging and apologizing, claiming she was just tired and frustrated, and that's why she'd taken things out on me. But my dad didn't accept her excuses. He told her he knew the real reason for her behavior. I still don't know what he meant by that, and to this day, he refuses to tell me. After that, my parents went into their bedroom, and I could hear them yelling at each other, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. About half an hour later, I heard my mom packing her bags while sobbing uncontrollably. My dad told my sister to go with her, and without a word, my sister agreed. By then, I had come out of my room, unsure of what was happening. All I knew was that whatever was going on, it wasn't good. Once my mom and sister left, it was just me and my dad. I finally worked up the courage to ask him what had happened, but he didn't say much. He just told me I was safe now, and that I wouldn't have to deal with my mom anymore. My dad was clearly in a terrible mood, so I didn't press for details. Instead, I went back to my room and stayed there. The next day, my dad came to me and apologized for how he'd acted the previous day. He explained that he had a lot on his mind, but reassured me that I wouldn't have to worry about my mom ever again. He told me he was filing for divorce and that from now on, it would just be the two of us. He also apologized for not noticing how bad things had been for me, and for the fact that I had to put up with my mom's behavior for so long. He said he wished I'd told him sooner, so he could have stopped it earlier. But he made it clear that his decision was final, and that he hoped we could build a better future together. Honestly, I was relieved to hear about the divorce. It meant I wouldn't have to deal with my mom ever again. For 17 years, she and my sister had made my life miserable. And with one video, I had ensured they wouldn't get the chance to do that for the next 17 years. So, I was pretty proud of myself for standing up to her and finally calling her out. It was well-deserved, and honestly, it was long overdue. The next few days were surprisingly peaceful. My dad spent most of his time quietly working in his office, and we only really talked during meals. Other than that, we kept to ourselves. I could tell he was hurting, but I didn't know how to make things better. I tried to support him in small ways. We had good conversations during meals, and those moments seemed to bring him some peace. But it was obvious that he was heartbroken and missed my mom, even if he didn't say it outright. A few days ago, my mom was officially served with the divorce papers. I found out because my grandparents, her parents, decided to call me and yell at me about it. My grandparents and I have never been close. They're just an extension of my mom's toxicity, and I've always kept my distance. When they called, I initially thought about ignoring them, but they kept calling non-stop. Eventually, I gave in and answered. The second I picked up, they started yelling, calling me a curse on the family and saying everyone would be better off without me. They've never liked me, but this was a new low. I told them they couldn't speak to me like that, but they shot back, saying they could talk to me however they wanted because I had ruined their daughter's life. They blamed me for the divorce, claiming I destroyed years of marriage with the one video I sent to my dad. They called me ungrateful, saying my mom had gone through a difficult pregnancy just to bring me into the world, something I didn't even know about until they mentioned it. My grandmother went so far as to say that my mom risked her life to have me, only for me to repay her by ruining her marriage. Then she took it a step further, saying she had suggested my mom terminate the pregnancy and that it would have been better if my mom had listened to her. She even said she wished I'd never been born. My grandfather wasn't any better. He twisted the knife even more, saying my mom was inconsolable after receiving the divorce papers. He asked if I was finally happy, now that I had the house to myself and my dad would never see my mom again. I tried to explain that it wasn't my intention. I never asked my dad to divorce my mom, but they hung up before I could defend myself. Then they blocked me. Since that call, I've been overwhelmed with guilt. I feel like the worst person on earth right now. I know they were trying to manipulate me, but part of me feels like they succeeded because I can't shake this awful feeling. I keep wondering if I need to fix this somehow. I've also been thinking a lot about whether I was even wanted in the first place. While I know I'm not adopted, I can't help but feel like I was an unwanted child. It explains so much about how my mom treated me growing up, and honestly, it's hard to stop dwelling on it now that everything has come to light. I'm not apologizing to my mom, and I'm definitely not trying to take back what I did. I'm not going to tell my dad to cancel the divorce or make any attempt to repair what's broken. That would be too much. My grandparents and my mom can stay mad at me if they want to. After everything they've put me through over the years, they don't deserve anything from me. Not forgiveness, not sympathy. The things my grandparents said to me during that phone call only cemented this for me. It's honestly a miracle I felt guilty at all, but I guess that's just the people pleaser in me. I'm working on that, though, so it doesn't affect my future decisions or keep me trapped in the same cycle. I talked to my dad about everything, and we agreed that therapy would be a good idea. I explained to him that the main reason I didn't tell him about my mom sooner was because I didn't want to hurt him. I knew the truth would break his heart. Part of me also naively hoped that my mom would eventually come around and start treating me like a human being, but that never happened. On top of that, I doubted myself. For some reason, I believed my dad wouldn't believe me if I told him the truth. That's why I felt I needed proof before I said anything. Now, though, I realize how much I've been holding back and how many issues I need to work through. Therapy feels like the right step forward, and if everything goes well, I'll be starting in a couple of days. A few hours ago, I finally learned the truth behind why my mother treated me the way she did. I asked my dad about something he'd said during his argument with my mom the day he kicked her out. I hadn't asked him about it before because it was such an emotionally draining day for everyone, and I didn't want to add to his stress. But today, I brought it up. I asked him what he meant when he said he knew the real reason behind her behavior. He told me the truth. I had been an unwanted pregnancy. My mom had decided she was done after having my sister and wanted to terminate the pregnancy when she found out about me. My dad, though upset, didn't tell her not to go through with it. But because she saw how much it hurt him, she decided to keep the baby, for his sake. I was born after a complicated pregnancy that took a serious toll on my mom. My dad thinks that's why she resented me so much. She had told him she never felt connected to me as a baby, but he assumed it was postpartum depression and thought it would pass with time. It never did. Even though I had already suspected something like this, hearing it from my dad was painful. Both of us ended up crying. He told me he feels responsible for everything I've gone through, and we hugged. It was a deeply emotional moment, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. Now that everything is out in the open, I feel so much better. I don't owe my mother anything. While I'm grateful she brought me into the world, she didn't treat me well after that, so I don't feel any obligation toward her. I've decided to let go of the resentment gracefully and move on with my life. Therapy has already been helping. I've been going for 2 weeks now, with one session focused on myself and another with my dad. These joint sessions have been great for helping us rebuild our relationship from scratch, and I'm hopeful that we can create a healthier bond moving forward. The divorce proceedings have officially started, and a few days ago, my mom and sister came back to collect the last of their things. They're both moving in permanently with my grandparents. Neither of them spoke to me or even made eye contact, which I'm grateful for because it meant I didn't have to deal with them. They can hate me all they want, but that doesn't change the fact that they created this situation through years of cruelty. Whatever happens to them now is out of my hands, and I refuse to feel sorry for them.